This is what the skies looked like in March. And this was 1 month later, when passenger numbers were a staggering 94% lower than the previous year, thanks to the COVID-19 pandemic. Business is now starting to pick up, but travel is becoming increasingly localised and complicated.
This world of quite easy travel and relatively free movement just sort of has evaporated almost overnight.
This will have consequences far beyond cancelled holiday bookings. It could exacerbate existing inequalities, create economic hardship, and disrupt the workings of the globalised world. The tourism industry is enormous. Every year, international holidaymakers spend $1.6 trillion. That's more than Spain's GDP. Or at least they did before the coronavirus pandemic.
The CDC just told everyone, do not travel.
Postpone or cancel all non-essential travel.
In April 2020, planes carried just 31 million passengers around the world, the sort of passenger levels last seen in the late 1970s.
In April this year, 200,000 passengers went through Heathrow Airport in London, which is fewer than would go through on any single day in a normal month.
IATA, the airline trade body, has said flights will not return to pre-pandemic levels for several years. In China, flights are now just 21% below normal levels, while in America, air traffic began to pick up in May, but remains 57% below normal. And in much of Europe, flight numbers are still around 75% lower than the same time last year. And while passenger numbers are creeping up, some areas, like business travel, may never recover. After the last financial crisis, the number of overseas business trips taken per person in the UK fell by a third and never picked up, whereas leisure travel did eventually climb back to pre-crisis levels. Were the same thing to happen again, it could have a significant impact on airline profits.
Business travellers actually subsidise leisure travellers. Your £250 transatlantic fare in the back of the plane is possible because somebody at the front of the plane is paying $800 or $1,500.
Airlines are already struggling.
Virgin Atlantic has announced plans to cut more than 3,000 jobs in the UK.
Air Canada lost more than $1 billion in the first quarter.
In March, IATA warned that without government aid, just 30 of the world's 700 or so airlines would make it through the pandemic. The airlines that survive will determine the competition and prices on certain routes.
Some airlines are in pretty good financial shape. Within Europe, there remains a lot of competition. Transatlantic flights, there is still plenty of competition, but on routes where there's much thinner competition, prices will go up, there's no doubt about that.
For the well-off, the price increases may be an annoyance, but they could also have a significant impact on global mobility, as lower-income travellers may find themselves priced out of the skies.
What happens with airfares and with the prices of flights affects not just summer holidays. Migrants have parents or spouses in one country and work in another. And for all of these people, it is quite important that they continue to be able to go home.
In June, 189 countries had imposed some form of travel restriction, ranging from measures like quarantine to border closures. And governments are desperate to open up travel as quickly as possible.
The government is to make it easier for British holidaymakers to travel to much of Europe this summer.
Though these arrangements may help tourists, they could also create an increasingly inequitable system.
The British government is working to allow Brits to go off on holiday to, say, Spain or France and come back without the need for quarantine. But that doesn't take into account the fact that someone may have a partner in America, parents in Nigeria, or siblings in Pakistan, and they won't be able to go see people who are very, very important to them. The risk is that we end up with a very uneven and possibly unfair system.
The relatively free movement enjoyed by many tourists is a modern phenomenon that has played an increasingly important role in globalization and domestic economies. Take China. For around 30 years until the end of the 1970s, travel to and from China was heavily restricted. But today, China sends more tourists abroad than any other country. And they spend more money. In 2018, Chinese tourists spent over $270 billion overseas, almost double that spent by Americans. And the limitations on travel caused by the pandemic could have a knock-on effect on global cooperation and economic growth.
The worry is that these restrictions persist in the long term and then become entangled in all sorts of other things, such as reciprocity, trade negotiations, any sort of geopolitical dispute between countries. And so we return to sort of mid-20th century world of closed borders, lots of restrictions and paperwork, and just less interchange between countries.
Faced with an ever-changing array of travel restrictions, many travellers are looking closer to home for their holidays. In May, 80% of total reservations on Airbnb were made domestically. And between January and April, foreign searches for summer holiday accommodation in Spain fell by as much as 94%. The rise in localised travel could be good news for the environment. In 2018, carbon dioxide emissions from commercial flights accounted for 2.4% of global fossil fuel emissions.
The answer to this quandary is not to stop people from flying. Rather, it's to make planes more efficient and to focus on innovation in the industry. The pandemic has accelerated the shift towards efficiency, so some older planes are being taken out of the sky.
The COVID-19 pandemic will dramatically affect the way in which people move around the world. But rather than driving economic growth, as the travel industry has in the past, new restrictions could affect globalization, sowing division and increasing inequality.
My name is Leo Mirani. I'm a correspondent on the Britain desk at The Economist. And if you'd like to read more about the impact that COVID-19 is having on international travel, click the link opposite.